The St. Kitts and Nevis Independence 40 Committee presents conversations, reflections, and a way forward. This interactive discussion series provides an in-depth view of the trials and achievements of the past, as well as the accomplishments, threats, and tremendous opportunities of today, and in the coming years that will transform the Twin Island Federation into a model sustainable island state, serving as a beacon for all. On this edition, we consider constitutional reform.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Malcolm Gishard Recreational Park in Penny's on the outskirts of Charlestown. I'm Ian Richards, welcoming you to Conversations, Reflections, and the Way Forward. Conversations is a 7-part engagement series commissioned by the Independence 40 Committee. Well, the Constitution of St. Kitts and Nevis lays out fundamental principles and laws that represent the ideals of the state. There have been many changes since St. Kitts and Nevis became independent to the physical, political, and socio-economic landscape over the decades, which raises the question, is it time for significant changes or moderate tweaks to the Constitution of St. Kitts and Nevis? Our conversation begins now with former Attorney General, the Honorable Delano Bat, Premier of Nevis and former Minister of the of the Government and also Member of the Federal Parliament, the Honorable Mark Brantley, President of the St. Kitts Nevis Sniper Association, which would be the Youth Parliament Association, Maria Knight, and also Attorney Eustace Nisbet. Gentlemen, welcome to Conversations.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Let's begin our discussion now and start with essentially the Constitution. Now, from your research or your studies, can you tell us what went into the framing of the Constitution? Anyone is welcome to begin.
I suppose because I had the good fortune of being present in the initial stages, well, during the constitutional discussions in London, I was fortunate, I'm fortunate to have been there. The idea, as I understood it, and still believe it to be, was that there was a need to find a formula that would make it work for both islands. Prior to that, we have had a history of St. Kitts, Nevis, and Anguilla. And then you had a secession, a revolution, and a unilateral declaration of Anguilla, which then went on its own. So when we got to London, there was a desire to try and see how we could pull the unit together, bearing in mind in particular the size of Nevis and whether it would survive internationally on in the open market, as it were. So that, in a sense, influenced the way that one went forward. Of course, there was also the issue as to the relationship between both countries and how best that could be addressed. And so those fed into the issue of what came out as the Constitution. To many, it has not been a perfect document, and no document in this day and age is. The end result is that it's the will and the mind of the individuals who have to work it. It's the mindset that helps to determine the success. I think we've had some areas of success, but yes, there are areas we just certainly need to look at to see how we can best improve it.
Did Britain have a role to play in the shaping of the Constitution back then? Any input from them?
Well, the truth was that by the time we got to independence, there had been a number of other templates in existence, right from Jamaica right through the Caribbean. I think we were the last to go. So there was a template in place, which essentially the British would have influenced from the beginning, and certainly we followed that. There were some tweaks. For instance, one of the important ones was the issue of how do you deal with the existing laws of the at the time of independence. For instance, I think Jamaica and others, the situation was an existing law remained valid irrespective of how it related to the Constitution, whereas by the time it came to us, we ended up with a situation where those existing laws could be modified in a way that allows them to be compatible with the Constitution.
Any feedback, Premier? Anyone else? Who would like to
Well,
say?
if I can just add, maybe we're all dating ourselves, but I was only about 14 years old when these negotiations were ongoing. So I clearly wouldn't have had the opportunity. I think my other two panelists here would have had that opportunity. But it's instructive that the former Attorney General says that the Constitution came after so many others in the Commonwealth of the Caribbean, because I think the St. Nevis Constitution is unique in all the world. We call it a federation. Some say it's not really a federation. It's some pseudo-federal structure, where, of course, Nevis has its own administration. St. does not. We only have the federal government in Bastille. And that, I think, has created some anomalies over the years in terms of how these governments function, how they interact. But there have been successive administrations and political pundits and legal scholars who have criticized the 1983 Constitution. I have often said that it is a document that was created that, if you will, was an ode to the realities of the time and to the conflicts that we knew existed, political conflicts between St. Kitts Nevis. I think Delano has referred to the situation with Anguilla. And so sometimes, with the benefit of hindsight, the criticisms come. But I often try to put myself in the position of those who were there trying to negotiate this document so that we can go into independence in 1983, as we did. And I believe that this was a document of compromise. Nevis clearly needed some assurances. Britain, I think, wanted to get rid of us. And so we needed to craft something which, in the end, is unique. One thing I would agree with is that ultimately it's for us to work this document. I say all the time, if you design the best train in the world and you put bad drivers, it's going to potentially run off the tracks. So we need people who I think are committed, people who understand. We have had this Constitution and its limits tested from time to time. As recently, I think, as 2022, we saw it being tested. Some of us, myself included, were not happy with the results of that test, but nevertheless, this is the reality. But I think that the fundamental principles in the Constitution, 40 years on, it is time for us to look afresh and to determine whether or not it's now time to craft a new document that is reflective of the changes that we've seen in terms of our society and our societal norms since independence.
Well, Ian, piggybacking off of the Premier, I was not even a thought around that time, so I wouldn't be able to chip in as it relates to what it was like at that time drafting the Constitution. But I think the former Attorney General has put it into some perspective, and I think the Honourable Premier is right when he says that it was crafted in such a way to solve the issues that were of the day in the best way possible, especially when you look at the fact that many other nations around the world, in particular the region, within the region, the islands that are together, we look at Trinidad and Tobago, their construct is nowhere close to ours with the amount of power that has been devolved, so to say, to the Nevis Island. And so when you look at this unique formula that was crafted, I think we see the advantage of us being last in line, the fact that we had so many templates to look at, the fact that we had time to analyze to see what was wrong, what needed to be implemented, and what was the best solution for us. And I think the fact that the Constitution has stood the test of time and has been tested for 40 years and still remains the supreme law of our land just goes to show how stable it has allowed our nation to be thus far. And even now, as we begin to do some introspection and see what could be tweaked, what could be modified, it shows that the framers, they did a very good job, I have to say. And even though there is criticism for the Constitution, we must build upon this and see, going forward, what is the best formula for this new age, this new paradigm of petitions and divisions as we look 40 years beyond and even beyond that time.
Mr. Bhatt, who were the framers of the Constitution?
Well, the way that I would, in terms of who came from here, if my memory serves me right, you had Dr. Simmons. I remember, I think Michael Powell was present. From the Nevis side, there was Mr. Simeon Daniel. I can't remember everybody, but certainly from the opposition, you had Limor at the time, and Ted Hobson came along. I think he was given an entree so that he could express some of the views here. Sam Kondo was present, and my good self. Those are the ones.
You were with the opposition or the government?
I was with the opposition at the time.
And so I would say, Mr. Knight, and I'll probably come to you first on this question in terms of the symbolism of the Constitution. What does it have for Kittitians and Nevisians, as citizens of St. Kitts and Nevis?
Well, I think when you look at the opening clauses of the Constitution, where we agree as a people who we are, it creates our identity not only in a legal sense, but in the sense that we are a nation under God. We respect the rules and rights of democracy and the freedoms established in the first chapters. I think the Constitution gives us that legal identity beyond people as we know ourselves. It gives us that ability to function our offices, our various responsibilities to each member as they operate within the sphere of St. Kitts and Nevis.
Mr. Nisbet?
Yes, thank you. Now, I would agree with Mr. Knight with regards to the freedoms that are expressed and what it means to us as a people. For Nevis in particular, I would say that perhaps it's a little bit more important with regards to the context, as my friend Mr. Bart spoke of, because of the history of the three island states that I think in 1957, with regards to the representative type government, yes. And that at that time, you had, I think, the balance of power that was placed in the hands of St. Kitts. So you had some differences of opinion shared between Anguilla, Nevis, and I think Anguilla and Nevis at that time may have held one head, as they say, in about regards to the relationship with St. Kitts. And then in 61, you would have had, I think it was Eugene Walwyn, if my memory serves me correct, who would have journeyed to St. Kitts to vent the frustration of Nevisians and Anguillans with Guyana. And then you had statehood in 67. And I think that is when you had, at the first time, a local council being established in Nevis. The offer was made to Anguilla, but I understand it, they never took that up. And then in 72, we would have had council elections in Nevis for the first time, and then elections in 80 prior to the Supreme Court order of June 1983. So at that time, the balance of power remained in St. Kitts, and the authority that the Nevis section had and Anguilla Island had was basically maintenance powers and so forth. So with the introduction of the Constitution, as the Premier said, it gave Nevis some level of autonomy to make some laws and so on, and quite a bit of laws. It's still not perfect, because there are some areas that I believe that the Premier and his predecessors wouldn't have wished that there is some more autonomy that would have been devolved over to Nevis. But be that as it may, it's a work in progress, and it has mean, I believe, quite a bit for the people of Nevis. And I thought I'd just put that in context, historical context, so you could see precisely how important it is for the people.
Here's my, just picking up from Mr. Nisbet, here's my dilemma with debates and discussions. I've been involved over my lifetime in a few of these discussions about the Constitution of St. Kitts and Nevis. It is always, in a way, a football. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm sure those who have spent some time on the political hustings, as I have, would recall that one side or the other often berate the Constitution and the provision of the Constitution. I think it is instructive, and I think the audience should understand that in 40 years of independence, not even a comma in this Constitution has ever been changed. That, I think, is an interesting historical fact, that despite the politicians despite the commentators, despite what has been said over the years, that we have not seen it fit, really, to do much in terms of an attempt to change the Constitution. If memory serves, I think the closest we would have come was in recent years when we tried to have a term limit in terms of the Prime Minister only being allowed to serve 2 terms. But 40 years on, nothing about the landscape of St. Kitts and Nevis is the same. Absolutely nothing. You know, we have seen, you know, the rights in terms of women, in terms of persons, labor force, how that works, in terms of youth, in terms of the voting age, in terms of, we have come of age in so many ways as a country, but we continue with this document that is 40 years old. And whereas other countries have had constitutional conferences and engagements, we have not. We have come to the brink, I believe, in my lifetime at least twice, to rend the country asunder and Nevis seceding. That has happened. In fact, it went as far as a referendum here. I think it was in 1997, if my memory serves, and it failed very narrowly, less than 5%. So the truth is that you've had these tests, and you know, one of the commentators here remarked that the Constitution has served us well. That, I think, is a question of debate, for debate, whether or not it has served us well. I think so much in this Constitution has never been really tested. In 2022, we had a real test. We had 6 sitting members of an 11-member parliament who went to the Governor General and said, we no longer want this individual as our Prime Minister. And that was a test, I think, of the Constitution. The Governor General's response was, I have no such power. And turned around and allowed that one individual to fire the 6 parliamentarians. It seemed to my mind that that made a mockery of our notion of democracy, because it means that 6 constituencies were rendered impotent. And one constituency, number 7, was elevated above the other 6 in terms of power, in terms of what that representative could do. Let us remember that when we vote in St. Kitts and Nevis, we don't vote for a Prime Minister. So, technically, all constituencies are the same. There are 11 constituencies, all are the same. And it is only after the people have voted in those constituencies and elected a representative, do those representatives then select one of their own to be the Prime Minister. And so I think 2022 was instructive. It was a very interesting time where we saw the constitutional provisions being tested. Even after 40 years, we've never had such a test until 2022. I would just add quickly that we are now in an era where we see emergence of I don't want to say new rights, but perhaps I should say new understanding of existing rights.
But let me stop you there.
Before you, I just wanted to add 2 things. The first is that one of the difficulties we have about the Constitution is the difficulty in relation to how you can amend or change. It's a unique situation, especially in relation to the matters which are in Schedule 1 to the Constitution. They require 2/3, but not a simple 2/3. It's a 2/3 in St. Kitts, and it's a 2/3 in Nevis. And what clearly, because you look at the temperature and you can tell that if you were to put anything forward, it depends upon the politics of the situation at the time, whether those who are in power would get the support of those who are in opposition. And that is a very difficult matter for us. And so, you know, in order to change the debate from simply being academic, we are also going to have to look at, is this method of change or amendments serves us well? That is something we'll have to look at.
But Mr. Bart, let me stop you.
And just one other quick point I wanted
what
to
I wanted to say is that, you know, we're looking, that is the way forward for the Constitution, but I still wanted to have it, you know, historical context before we move forward to these type of discussions. And so, as we're speaking about the symbolism of the Constitution today, I understand, of course, that there are the challenges, and certainly we'd want to delve into that. We have an hour and a half, well, time is counting down, of course, to continue to have these type of discussions, and it's something that we certainly would want to get into. But I want to give the public, especially persons like Mr. Knight, who wasn't here, and others who may be looking to get a bit of the history behind the Constitution and how it was framed. So the question generally, and Premier, perhaps you would want to take a crack at it in terms of the symbolism of the Constitution for persons who are resident and nationals of this country.
Well, certainly I think the Constitution is our supreme law. And the symbolism of it for me is that it ought to embody who we are as a people, who we are as a nation. As we get to the other part of the conversation that you've already signaled we'll get to, which is the part that I'm most interested in, is whether or not it still does embody who we are as a nation, because it has not evolved. While we have evolved, I'm not sure the Constitution has evolved. So that, I think, is a debate. But in terms of symbolism, definitely it's important, and I believe that St. Kitts and Nevis should be rightly proud that we have very high regard for the rule of law here, despite the difficulties that we encounter politically from time to time. We have changed governments democratically in free and fair elections for the most part. We have not had coups and those types of events, unconstitutional occurrences that we've seen elsewhere. We have, I think, here a good regard and respect for human rights and the rights of each other. And I think those are the fundamental building blocks: freedom of speech, the ability for us to sit here and engage, even criticize our governments, engage and criticize our institutions. We take a lot of that for granted. Freedom of religion, we take a lot of that for granted, but that does not necessarily exist everywhere. So I think that the Constitution, which encapsulates a lot of what we take for granted, it is the catalyst for a lot of what we take for granted, and really has framed the interactions that we have amongst each other and between the citizen and the state. But as I said, I think that I will await the other part of the conversation, because I have some thoughts there as to where I think we need to go.
And that's exactly where we're having this conversation. Mr. Bott, tell us a bit about how the Constitution was introduced to the public.
Well, if my memory serves me correctly, the discussions took place in London. They were held at Marlborough House, which is the place where normally the constitutions were being crafted and drafted at the time. And they came back, and I think the Parliament simply passed it. There wasn't a referendum or anything of that kind. The Parliament simply passed it, and it was brought into law.
And how was it accepted?
Well, it was, because you didn't have any real pushback as such. I think you had one or two minor objections, but in the end it just simply, we worked with it as a country.
But if I recall, it was the opposition of the day, because I believe
there was
Lee Moore had proposed a different approach.
That's right. There was a green paper,
yes,
which had raised certain issues, and but they were not accepted, and so in the end we ended up living with the Constitution as it is.
Can you give us a sense of what some of those issues might have been?
Well, a lot of it centered around, well, it's not so much many, but the main one was exactly the nature of the relationship between St. Kitts and Nevis. And there was the idea of a treaty of friendship between the two countries, and that would set out and earmark the actual boundaries in relation to the two islands, and then that really would have been the way forward. But that was not accepted.
Okay. How would you say the Constitution has played a role, and anyone can answer here and begin to contribute, played a role in defining the nation's identity?
I think in a way that in consideration of the fundamental rights that are enshrined therein, that it speaks volume as to where we are as a nation, being able to recognize the human rights that I suppose, have some kind of an international flavor. And those rights, and I suppose, as the Premier said, that there may be some need to update them, considering that there have been some changes or advancement with regards to how we live, in particular, perhaps education, sexual orientation, and things of the sort, because the Constitution itself has not gone that far to deal with some, or to guarantee some of those rights. For example, in the UK, those rights would be recognized, like education and so on, considering that the fundamental rights would have been born out of the European Convention of Human Rights, which the UK have as their Human Rights Act. So, but by and large, those rights, I believe, are key to what we believe in, and protection, because the protection of our citizens and recognizing their rights, I believe, is key and important in any democratic society. And St. Kitts Nevis have such rights established, and I suppose most of the Commonwealth would have those as well. But that being said, I think those rights are play and signify where we are as a nation in part.
Mr. Knight, anything you'd care to add there?
I would just support Mr. Nisbet on that. The rights that we hold as a people that are preserved through the Constitution, established through the Constitution, and again, going back to the system that was uniquely created for us, given our circumstances at that time and still that we face today. I think those are what allow us to create that Kittitian identity born out of the Constitution.
Therein lies the problem. You see, you just said we're creating a Kittitian identity.
Kittitian and Nevis. My apology. My apology.
That is part of the problem.
My apology.
You know, we need to be able to create a Kittitian and Nevisian identity.
Yes.
Because so long as we continue to see ourselves as different, then that inevitably will be the result. So I think the language is important as we look forward. Picking up from what Mr. Nisbet said about rights, I think all of us in this room and all of us who are viewing remember a time when we read about a time when slavery was entirely legal. That there was a time women had no rights. When, for example, if you did not own land, you could not vote. We need to reflect that rights and our understanding of what rights are, human rights, has been an ongoing evolution over time. And that rights enshrined in 1983, 40 years ago, may not now reflect fully the realities of our society today. And I think Mr. Nisbet mentioned some of those rights, sexual orientation, LGBTQ plus rights, etc. These are uncomfortable conversations for us because of our peculiar history, because perhaps of the very thing that Mr. Knight referred to, that our Constitution announces at the outset, that we are a nation believing in God, and it defines or seeks to define who we are. I think a question that we have to confront is whether who we are 40 years ago is still who we are. Whether who we are in 1983 is still who we are in 2023. And that, I think, is the question that has to be confronted head on. And in confronting that question, some uncomfortable conversations need to be had. You know, where are we going? Whether or not we will respond. And we see that debate playing out across the world. We saw it in Uganda, for example, recently, the Ugandan government taking a particular position in relation to LGBTQ plus rights. We see the reaction to that from some countries. We're hearing about a diplomatic spat between the United States and Jamaica at the moment concerning the same issue. And I think it's going to come to a head at some point. And that's just one example of issues which demand certainly a conversation, whatever the result is, because I believe the voice of the people is the voice of God. Ultimately, we will determine which direction we're going. But the conversation is necessary. And we can't continue down the road of ignoring it and pretending that it doesn't exist, because it exists. And we either going to have that conversation and take a position as a nation, or we may face a situation where we have that position being taken for us by others who are far more powerful. So that, I think, is the crux for me of the Constitution, yes, defining who we are, but the Constitution also needs to reflect that who we are keeps evolving.
Mr. Burke?
Well, I agree. It's a living document, but it has to evolve, and it's not doing so in the process. But it's a question of recognizing, as we move forward, things which the Premier has referred to as perhaps being uncomfortable to address at the time. But now it becomes clear that you've got to recognize it in the context of human rights. Because at the end of the day, the rights that people would need to enjoy, have to enjoy, is essentially a human right. It is significant and important to the issue of their dignity as a human being. And you will find as we go on, more and more, those rights are going to crystallize in forms which might be uncomfortable, but as we move forward and generational change takes part, becomes more acceptable.
That diplomatic space that the Premier mentioned, of course, is one where the suggestion is made that CARICOM should tackle. They should come together and have a uniform position on that.
Well, the difficulty with that is, at the end of the day, it's such an important domestic issue in terms of when it comes to it on the domestic front, that I'm not sure that you can have a uniform foreign policy, as it were, on a matter of that kind. It's going to depend on the conservatism of certain societies. Some would be much more liberal, and to be quite frank, CARICOM has to take on board the fact that no matter what the heads say, at the end of that, something like that, it's either going to be accepted by the country, or you're going to have tremendous pushback on it. And so I'm not sure that it's a CARICOM issue, to be quite frank. Recognizing the right to do so, recognizing those rights, but in terms of implementing and enforcing them, I don't think it's a comfortable position for a CARICOM policy, I should say.
If I could just add to what Delana is saying, because I agree wholeheartedly. I think that what's important, we may ultimately get to a CARICOM position. I think before we get there, we need to ascertain the domestic position of the various CARICOM constituent elements in relation to some of these matters. Because, as I say, we're either going to confront them or they will confront us. And what we're seeing playing out currently between Jamaica and the United States is but an early manifestation of that reality. So we need to determine in St. Kitts and Nevis, in Antigua and Barbuda, Trinidad and Tobago, where we stand on some of these issues. And then perhaps those domestic positions can inform a regional approach, if in fact some consensus could be arrived at. But I absolutely think that the time has come for us to deal with those issues. I will just add that because I feel our Constitution has not necessarily evolved, it hasn't, the language in it hasn't changed in 40 years. What I have observed is that what tends to happen is when issues arise, our judges, many of whom are younger judges, they, in my respectful view, find themselves in all kinds of contortions to arrive at a conclusion that respects human rights. And what I mean by that, for example, is I feel sometimes that when issues arise, our courts start looking at what the European Court of Justice is saying, what the UK courts might be saying, what even the US Supreme Court might be saying, the Canadian courts are saying, in order, if you will, to take that and graft it onto our constitutional provisions. So where our constitutional provisions are not necessarily clear, the right to privacy, for example, our judges have had to, I don't want to use inaccurate language, but the only language that is coming to me is manufacture. They've had to find a way to get these rights, create these rights, and oftentimes by looking at what is happening elsewhere, where their legal framework is in fact different in terms of the language that they have encapsulated in their documents that guide them. And I think that that also speaks to our need to evolve. There's a desperate need for me, for us to just confront this and say, it's time for us to look at this Constitution afresh.
Premier, gentlemen, stand by. We are at the half-hour mark already, and so we're going to take a quick break, but just for the benefit of viewers who may not be aware, just a quick explanation about the diplomatic spat that we're referring to. It's in regards to a diplomat with a same-sex partner being assigned to Jamaica. We'll take a quick break and be right back.
Nicest place, but I run from him and defend it like a Lencha say. Now sell out me country, my little paradise. Yeah. I am a product of the island. I know where else I wouldn't change if you know what I know. Land of beauty.
The St. Kitts and Nevis Independence 40 Committee presents Conversations, Reflections, and the Way Forward. This interactive discussion series provides an in-depth view of the trials and achievements of the past, as well as the accomplishments, threats, and tremendous opportunities of today, and in the coming years that will transform the Twin Island Federation into a model sustainable island state, serving as a beacon for all. On this edition, we consider constitutional reform.
Welcome back to Conversations, Reflections, and the Way Forward. Our topic this evening is constitutional reform. And with us is former Attorney General Delano Bart, the Premier of Nevis, the Honorable Mark Brantley, Maurel Knight, who is the President of Sniper, and Attorney Mr. Eustace Nisbet. Gentlemen, let's continue our conversation now about the Constitution and take a look at in terms of some of the specific aspects of the Constitution that needs to be reformed to better align today's society. We touched on it a bit, but what would you say you would like to see changes there?
I think I'll take the jump on this one. I think the foremost issue that needs to be tackled when we begin looking seriously at the Constitution as it is at this point is the issue of the Caribbean Court of Justice being our final court of appeal. And what I find interesting is that when you examine our Constitution against the constitutions of our neighbors, it's not required that that goes to a vote through a referendum to change it from His Majesty in Council, the Privy Council, being our final court of appeal. However, I would still be of the mind that the people's voice should be consulted on that matter, whether it is through town halls or other public consultation. But I think the fact that in 2023, we still go to the United Kingdom to have our final appellate matters heard, that's not something I think we should be minded to do, given our desire to be independent and the fact that 40 years ago we declared to the world that we are independent. I think in order to be independent, we must be independent in all three branches of government. And so I think it's high time that we align ourselves to the Caribbean Court of Justice. And I know that is a very controversial topic at times, as there are persons who may not trust the Caribbean system, as it were. But I think that requires a changing mindset that we can trust our own people to deliver on certain matters.
Anyone else?
Well, perhaps I can follow through on that because that's a very important matter. I've also had the good fortune of serving on the commission. Well, first of all, I had the good fortune of being involved in the drafting of the instruments for the court. And then I've since, having left government and diplomatic work, I've served some 6 years on the commission, which is the administrative structure that helps to keep the court to function. I think there are three important things I'd like to identify which makes it necessary for us as a people to appreciate where we have got to and how best our interest is protected in relation to those instruments. The first is that there is a trust fund which we have all contributed to, and that trust fund is intended to provide and has been providing the financing for the court, which means that the court does not have to go back to the governments and ask for money for it to continue to function. The court is financially independent, and so it can make decisions without having to worry about offending a government. The second thing that I think is also important is that that court is available to us as citizens, not just at the appellate level, but in terms of the original jurisdictions. And you would recall that there's the case of Myrie, where there were some individuals who had difficulties about the free movement, which even if the government from the country which they were from did not want to assist them, there is a built-in mechanism that gives individuals the right to petition and access that court. In terms of the quality of the jurisprudence that comes out of the court as a whole, I don't think anyone can complain about it. In fact, there are instances where the Privy Council has looked at the judgments of the court and have taken them on board. So we have an institution that understands us. It's Caribbean. It's not remote. It's independent. And it is there to provide a service. And what's more, we have already financed our membership of it. There was a time when there was an issue as to whether or not one needed a referendum for that. That debate, insofar as we are concerned, is now clear. St. Lucia's constitution has the same provision that we have. It can be done by agreement between us and the British government and CARICOM, etc. And so there's no real need for us to be dragging our feet. In fact, one of the other things that I'd like to point out, when you look at the commission over the period of time, St. Kitts and Nevis has had a substantial number of petitions and divisions who have sat on the commission. St. Kitts and Nevis has also had the distinction of providing the second president to the court. That is enough to tell us that it belongs to us and we should take part and join it. So on that point, I wholeheartedly agree that there's a need for fundamental recognition that it's time for us to address it. The other thing that's important is that there isn't an issue about how the Chief Justice is appointed. You have a mechanism which allows the heads to agree. It doesn't have to be a unanimous one like we've had in the OECS, which has led to problems and delays in relation to the appointment of the Chief Justice. The President can be appointed by a qualified majority and make the thing a working system. So I'm wholeheartedly, I suppose you will say I'm biased in having been involved in the instruments and being involved in having served on it, but having been exposed to quite a lot, including practicing in the UK, I'm satisfied that we have a court that is fit for purpose.
And we continue to...
I find myself in the uncomfortable position of disagreeing about the CCJ. Disagreeing in the sense that part of the very definition of independence must be that you can choose. And I agree with what has been said in the context of saying that the quality of justice is no better in England. I'm not making a decision on the quality of our judges or the quality of the justice that we expect. But I think the Privy Council has served us well. And the question that we must ask is it a requirement for us to be truly independent, to abandon the Privy Council? It's a similar question, I'm sure you're going to get to it in time, about the monarchy and whether or not there's a need for us to demonstrate somehow that we're independent because we've abandoned the monarchy. I want our independence to be less about symbolism and more about substance. And that for me is sometimes I think we get involved in an emotional debate about get rid of the Privy Council, those are vestiges of colonialism. And we want to jettison institutions that have served us well and served us for a very long time. We look at some of the rights now that we champion. The Privy Council has had an approach to those, I may even say an enlightened approach to those, long before the Caribbean did, in terms of how we treat we take the death penalty, for example, and their own views on that and how that has shaped and informed the jurisprudence that has come. I feel that the former Attorney General here, Mr. Bart, is right that our citizenry already has access to the original jurisdiction of the court, because as I understand it, the court deals with disputes that arise under our treaty that establishes CARICOM. That being the case, the Myrie case, for example, that could have been somebody from St. Kitts and Nevis. Delano, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but it could be any individual. It could have been myself or anybody here on the panel could have moved the CCJ on a matter such as that. So we already have access to the CCJ within the context of the CARICOM Treaty. I believe where the debate comes in is whether or not we should have the CCJ now as our final court for all appellate matters, and therefore remove the Privy Council. And for me to be persuaded, I think we would need to show more than the quality of justice is the same. I would want to understand more than, oh, because it's in the Caribbean, it's more independent, and it's a demonstrative of greater independence on our part. I feel that we have institutions that work. There's no pressure on us to change those institutions, simply because we are trying to satisfy some emotional sense of what independence should look like. And that I feel very strongly about that. And as I said, we may get to debate about monarchy or republicanism, but that's also my view. You replace one figurehead in England with another figurehead in Bastille. What's the difference? How does that affect the people of the country?
Well, just two little points. I know you've cut me before. I'm not going to let you cut me on this one. 2 points. The first is that you are already paying for it. That's point one.
And we already have access to it.
Well, and that is part of the dilemma, because you trust it. You trust the court in the original jurisdiction, but you're not trusting it in the appellate jurisdiction.
Well, you define it in the context of trust. I'm not talking about trust. No, but I don't.
It has to be. If you're satisfied about the quality of justice in the original jurisdiction, it's a question of trust. If you can trust it in that jurisdiction, why are you having a difficulty with its appellate?
Because I also trust the Privy Council, which has served as well.
All right. Well.
So I don't see I'm not getting into a qualitative debate. I'm simply saying that I don't think that it's a requirement of our independence that we abandon some of the institutions that have served us well.
Well, we'll disagree on this one.
We'll agree to disagree.
Right, but
We'll disagree. Yeah,
I think the discussion about the CCJ certainly is a conversation that we can have, and certainly the two of you would be ideal panelists for that discussion at the time. But we want to get back to the discussion on the Constitution, because Mr. Knight is the one who would have said that that is something that he thinks needs to be reformed in terms of having it as the final court of appeal for St. Kitts and Nevis. But we're looking specifically at other aspects of reform to the Constitution that you would like to see that aligns with the aspiration and the dreams of Kittitians and divisions.
Perhaps I should chime in, and not to get back to the return to the debate with regards to the court. Myself and the Premier, I think we hardly agree on much, but I would have to agree with him on that. I don't think there's anything much I could add. But I think one of the things that perhaps is recent that shouldn't escape us today would be the issue of perhaps the appointment of leaders of opposition and so on, both in St. Kitts and Nevis, based on the current framework of the Constitution that suggests that if there is not a representative, at least, that could support another one, that there is no leader of the opposition in that regard. I believe that the time has come that we must address that dilemma, because it is. And this is not the first time that has arisen. I think some time back it would have been under the leadership of the late former Premier, Van Samring, that Mr. Parry, if I recall, he was the sole representative on the opposite side.
Oh, it's 2017.
2017, okay. And then, back then, there was the appointment of a leader of opposition by the then Premier. I think the Constitution clearly speaks to how that is done, and it says it should be someone that is opposed to the administration. In that regard, there was somebody, if I recall, who might have been sitting on talk shows and part and parcel of the CCM administration, who was appointed as the leader of the opposition in that regard. So there is something that must be said, and there is the current dilemma. Again, I think Mr. Parry in recent time may have been, I'm not sure if he was, you might be able to correct that. Okay. And then you have had successive situations where that have arisen, and in recent time, as late as 2022, late December 2022, that have arisen again. And there's still a flux with regards to that. So I believe in these modern times, as we talk about, we speak to moving with the times, the minority must be heard. They must have a voice. And there is need for a leader of the opposition. That is something I believe that should not be swept under the rug.
So I feel, if I can respond to that, that the examples in Nevis are interesting examples. If it is that a party in Nevis, in opposition, has only one seat, then it would seem obvious that one individual should lead the opposition because they're the only individual in the opposition. If the scenario, however, is that you have more than one individual winning a seat, but those individuals cannot agree as to who should be leader of the opposition, it raises different issues. Because even in the context of, say, let us say we were to give the Governor General or the head of state, if we were to move to a republic, the president, that right to determine, how does that individual determine which of contesting parties ought to be? So I think that it needs some careful thought and careful analysis. But if I can say the areas, I've mentioned LGBTQ, that's a pet peeve of mine because I think that that's a gorilla in the room that needs to be confronted. So I think any reform of our Constitution has to treat with that issue. But I also think the scenario that unfolded in 2022, where the position that was taken by the then Governor General is that he could not recall a prime minister once appointed. That is something that I think also requires some reform. I think it is running a horse and buggy through the idea of democracy that 6 elected representatives will be fired by 1, but 1 can't be fired by 6. There's something fundamentally wrong with that in my view. If we are saying that we live in a democracy where every vote counts and every voter is equal, it means that interpretation, and that's what it was in my humble opinion, that interpretation taken by the then Governor General was that once you were elevated to the position of Prime Minister, that you were king, essentially. And I don't think that is what our framers could have intended, that such an individual would be king. And it also means that individual, when so elevated, can hold the country to ransom. We went into an election in 2020. Because of that scenario playing out, we were forced back into an election within, 18 months, instead of the usual 5-year term. Elections have consequences in terms of society and the divisiveness that elections sometimes engender. And all of that was caused, in essence, because the head of state took a view that there was no avenue for change midterm. And so I think that a reform of the Constitution should set that out. I believe that elected representatives at any point should be able to change their mind and say, well, once the majority says, we have Mr. Nisbet today, we no longer think Mr. Nisbet is the one, we are supporting Mr. Knight. Within the context of a term, I think that ought to be a possibility.
So how does that bode for stability, though?
Huh?
How does that bode for stability?
Well, look at the opposite. Did the opposite lead to any stability? The answer is no. Because the country was forced into a premature election very early. And what we had was an individual having been elevated because he or she was selected by the colleagues. And that, I think, is the irony, that the colleagues select the prime minister. But once he's selected as prime minister, the colleagues then have no further say in the matter. They can't say they change their mind. They can't say that this prime minister isn't performing satisfactorily.
They can't say anything else.
But there's a motion of no confidence.
Yes, I was
There's a safeguard.
I think Premier
motion
comes
of
down.
confidence leads again to instability, because with the motion of no confidence, what happens?
No, but we're talking about the remedy.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm saying
there's an
that's a
available remedy.
But the remedy, in my view, is a nuclear remedy. It's a nuclear option, because once you have the motion of no confidence, what is likely is that the same constitution then gives the person in the position of prime minister, if that motion succeeds, he either resigns or what? Tells the GG to dissolve parliament.
But there's also another remedy, because if I recall, there's the provision where between the election and the sitting of the first sitting of parliament, which is usually about 90 days, that you could recall your decision to make him the prime minister. So there are two safety nets that are there within the constitution to deal with those.
Yeah, but you're talking a 90-day period, Mr. Nisbet, in the context of a 5-year term. So if you don't change your mind within 90 days, you're saying that for the next
certainly,
4 years and 9 months.
in this situation, it wasn't changed within 5 years. It was, well, not within 5 years, but way short of 5. But the point is just to show that there are some safety nets. And I take your point that there may be some need to review those, because that is what the discussion is about, as to how we could move forward with regards to something that could work. But I just thought that I would point out, for the sake of completeness, that there are two safety nets that are there within the confines of those.
Mr. Bart?
Well, I somehow share a different view to the Premier. My understanding of the Constitution is that the Governor General cannot act unless there is a vacancy in relation to the position of Prime Minister. So it matters not what is happening around him. It matters not who is supporting him or not supporting him. If the vacancy hasn't been created, then the Governor General cannot act. And I take the point. It's a very uncomfortable position. We are 6, maybe fired, as opposed to the reverse. But the need for stability, and I share Mr. Nisbet's view, the need for stability, in my mind, supports this approach, because there is in fact a mechanism. If there's a no confidence vote, and if, as I recall, we were well on our way to that no confidence vote when he called the elections. If there's a no confidence vote and he doesn't resign, then the Governor General can act in accordance with the Constitution. But I'm not sure that we will gain any valuable benefit by simply saying, simply because there is, as it were, lack of support, that you actually immediately bring the House down in that context. So we'll have to disagree on that one.
Except that I'm not suggesting, Delano, that you bring the House down. That's the whole point. I'm suggesting you bring the Prime Minister down. And that is the fundamental difference. No. I think it's a point.
He's going to bring the House down.
No, that is exactly where you and I are parting company.
Right.
Because you two are elevating the Prime Minister to the position of king. I am saying that if we're going to look at reforms, we need to look at reforms, because a Prime Minister can have no legitimacy unless he or she has the support of the elected majority. What gives a Prime Minister the legitimacy in our system? It's the fact that he or she says, I have these people lined up behind me who are elected representatives. And I have a majority of elected representatives behind me. There's a purpose, I think, why the framers said it has to be elected representatives who determine who the Prime Minister is. He must have that support. So the minute he loses that support, the very thing that gives him legitimacy disappears. If you say to me that, oh, it doesn't matter, you said so on Monday that you support him, so if in a year and a half time you change your mind, he still continues as Prime Minister. And that is the interpretation, I think a traditional interpretation, but in my view it is wrong. And it runs a horse and buggy through the notion of what our democracy should look like and how it ought to function. So what crashed was, you're right, the whole government crashed. But what should have crashed was the office of the Prime Minister. So therein, I think, is where the instability arises. And the notion of a motion of no confidence sounds good. but the motion opposes the nuclear option. Because if it succeeds, the Constitution still gives the Prime Minister the option either to resign or to dissolve the Parliament and call a fresh election. So, to me, if it stopped there, if it said that the motion of confidence, if it succeeds, the Prime Minister must resign, then I would be happy with that. But it gives a further option where you say, or dissolve and call fresh elections, which plunges the whole country back into an election cycle and the uncertainty that can result. So I think as we talk about reform, these are some of the things that need to be clarified. And whether it is Mr. Barth and Mr. Nisbet's position or whether it is my position, but it should be made clear rather than it being left to some functionary to determine whether they have the power to act or not to act. And we've seen the results of that.
The danger that I think exists there is this. I think when we started, you spoke to the value of the Constitution and what it meant to us, and the fact that we have not experienced any coup or anything of the sort in St. Kitts Nevis. Now, the approach I think, respectfully, that you're taking, the opinion that you hold, would technically lead to that without perhaps framing it that way. Because what you're doing, you're saying, because we go back to the issue of representation. You said, well, hey, it's a representative type government, is representation. But there are people who would have voted for these representatives, right? Now, to go back and to perhaps remove a prime minister without using any of the provisions that are there to say, well, hey, step aside and let somebody else lead. To me, that in itself is a coup.
Because you're not using everything.
You have not used any of the tools available. You're not going back to the people.
But remember, in fairness to me, I'm saying that we ought to reform. I'm not saying that we do that under the existing provisions. I'm saying that as we contemplate reform, we should look at mechanisms that will allow us to say, step aside, you no longer have the support of the majority.
But you did reference and said that you presented, you approached the Governor General
to
that effect.
And he took a view. We in fact had taken legal constitutional advice which suggested that he had the power. He took a view that he didn't. All I'm saying is in the context of reform, it should be made clear whether the head of state has that power or not.
Oh, fair enough.
That's the point that I'm trying to make.
And just one point, Premier, I would like to mention that you mentioned that what crashed was the office of the Prime Minister. To my mind, the office of the Prime Minister is a symbol. It's an office, not necessarily an individual. And so, I just wanted to make that point there in that respect.
Well, if I'm given the choice whether the individual who occupies an office is removed or just the way I see it, I just think that in the context of a true democracy where the number 9 and number 6 and number 4 as constituencies are equal under the Constitution, and that the voter in number 7 has no greater power than the voter in number 11, then that ought to reflect its way and permeate throughout the constitutional provisions and how we work the Constitution. So if it's a question of whether or not a particular elected individual holds a particular office, whether that elected individual holding that office goes, or whether an entire government collapses, I would choose the individual going.
But the post, the office of the Prime Minister will
the office of the Prime Minister will remain,
right.
Instead it will be occupied by somebody else.
Right, of course.
And the government continues.
Right, because government is continuous.
Sure, absolutely.
So the objectives of constitutional reform should be what?
I think it's a mix of what everyone has said thus far, ensuring that the living document before you reflects what's happening now, what we've seen over the past 40 years, as the Premier is saying, clarifying the results from whatever tests we've seen over these past years, to ensure that the government continues, the Constitution continues, and our society continues under the principles and freedoms that we've had thus far. And as it continues to evolve, it continues to keep up with what's happening around it. I think that should be the objective of constitution reform. And then we could even go as far as saying, if our constitution is based on so many templates of countries gone before, constitution reform could also be seen as us adding our own flair to the constitution, our continued drive to make it uniquely our own and departing from what has been the tradition and the norm that was passed on to us. And so I think all in all, it would be just keeping it as a document that reflects our society now. That should be the underlying primary aim of constitutional reform.
Mr. Bard?
I agree. You've got to look at what has gone in the past, see how you can improve that, and then make the appropriate adjustments. Of course, the difficulty is how do you get consensus? Because it's not that easy to do so as you move forward. But yes, I agree. Essentially, that's the way we should move.
And so to implement constitutional reform, what is the process as it currently stands?
Well, the way that it's normally done, because there isn't any particular process identified in the Constitution, but normally what one has is a debate within the community. Normally the government will establish a constitutional reform committee. They'll have open debates on the issue. Then a draft bill will be prepared. It will then be discussed again in the public. And of course, you then have to look at your ability to get it through the House, which might be easy, but in our case, how do you get it through the country in terms of the 2/3 majority in both individual sections of this thing? So that's more or less the process. Of course, you'll have a variation on that, but that's generally how it's done.
Well, the question, I think, is a very important question, and it's one I've struggled with myself, because while I think Delano is right, the truth is that different provisions of our current constitution are entrenched at different levels.
Right,
Yes,
that's
correct.
right.
So some, for example, can be changed with a simple act of parliament. Others require a 2/3 majority, referendum as the case may be. Some are double entrenched, as it is said. So some provisions are harder to change than others. So that's part of the dilemma that I face, is if you're going to do sort of an overall review of the Constitution, how do you determine, well, having decided what aspects of the Constitution you're going to change, how do you determine what the procedure ought to be? Because if we're going to change some provisions, which can merely be an act of parliament, we're going to change other provisions which require, the secession clause, for example, 113. I think to change that, you require a referendum in St. Kitts and a referendum in Nevis. I can be corrected on that, but
That's
that is my
correct.
recollection.
That's correct.
And that's, you know, the line has referred to Schedule 1 of the Constitution. Those are provisions that are entrenched at the highest possible level. So those definitely involve a referendum, but there are other provisions that don't. So it might be easier to change the Constitution bit by bit, meaning that you change those provisions that are easier to change in terms of just requiring a majority in Parliament. And then you tackle the provisions that require that 2/3 majority, in some cases 2/3 on St. Kitts, and as he has pointed out, 2/3 on Nevis. So it's not even 2/3
Overall.
collectively. 2/3 in St. Kitts, 2/3 in Nevis. If you can get St. Kitts and Nevis people to agree, so that 2/3 of them agree on an issue there in St. Kitts and 2/3 agree on an issue here in Nevis, then that would be a miraculous result in my view. So it really points to the difficulty of it all. I have seen, I confess I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but I've seen in some countries where they've sort of, how should I say, repatriated the entire document. They've just, you know, framed a new constitution entirely and abandoned what was and put a new constitution in place. How our law will treat that and whether or not that's possible under St. Kitts Nevis law might be another debate for another time.
Well, all you'll effectively be doing is passing what you have as the Constitution, as the law of your country. You're not going to be able to leave out anything. Well, or otherwise you're going to have a problem in terms of the actual process of amendment. Mm-hmm. So that is a difficulty.
And that's what I was going to ask in terms of how did that work?
Right.
Where you would have seen that then?
Well, I think
The Canadians did it.
the Canadians, I mean, there's precedent for it, where I think they've just sort of wholesale changed the
whole
entire
problem.
constitution and enacted a new constitution. But the issue for me is the mechanism to allow that. I mean, that would be ideal for us if we could achieve that, but the mechanism for doing that. But if we're just looking at the 1983 constitution and how do we change that constitution, then, as I said, you start to deal with now levels of entrenchment and what sections require this and what sections require that in order to change it. And not all sections require a referendum, but some do.
Well, perhaps I had focused more on the difficult changes in relation to the Constitution, because it's right. In terms of some of the provisions, they can certainly be amended by the House with the appropriate majority. In such a situation, the process for reform may be a white paper by the government which sets out exactly what it proposes to do, and then there's a debate in the country about that, and then the government decides. And so it doesn't have to go into the much more detailed approach which I had outlined in relation to the more difficult entrenched provisions.
And so
But you know, as the Premier's touched on 113, I think perhaps I should say one of the difficulties, I believe, although I think there's more of a movement towards togetherness as opposed to what existed before. One of the difficulties, I believe, is that its continued presence in the Constitution undermines confidence between the two countries. It may not necessarily be a topic on a daily basis, but it undermines confidence. And I tell you where it does. It can affect the federal government's commitment in relation to investing in Nevis on the basis that you can get up any time and say goodbye. And I remember in '67, when the debate was, when we got close to the referendum, that there was a remark made, well, whatever debts you guaranteed, you will have to deal with them yourself. And so I think that is a source that undermines. And so I think, whilst I'm not saying you should scrap it just like that, I think one could look at the likelihood of establishing some kind of sunset provision, turning it into a sunset provision. And maybe we can get consensus between the two countries, where after 5 years or 10 years, if it's not acted on, then it dies. And then you can have a level of confidence coming back.
But I think that's a question of perspective, because while you say it may create unease in St. Kitts, I think it creates some comfort in you.
You see, but then if it creates unease in St. Kitts, and the federal government has the purse in relation to funds to be invested here in Nevis, you may have your comfort, but you may not be getting the level of commitment in terms of financial arrangements between the two countries.
So I agree, and I think that what I think is necessary then is a reorientation of how we think, how we treat the country, how we see the country, you know, whether we see the country truly as St. Kitts and Nevis, or we see the country as St. Kitts with some appendage that is Nevis. And I think that has really been the bane of our existence as a federation for a long time. The clause, the very existence of the clause, I think speaks to the difficulties that the country has had. The question is whether or not we have matured enough now that those difficulties are behind us. Right. And therefore we must now move to an abolition of that particular provision.
But you're quite right, because that was fundamental in '83 in keeping the country together. But I think we've moved on beyond that. But what you still need is a sense of commitment. And one of the commitments that one needs is a commitment not to leave us, for Nevis to leave the Federation. Otherwise, that is going to constantly remain as an undermining factor. And to my mind, you just can't rush into it, I accept that. But some kind of consideration of a sunset provision is something that we can look at.
Mr. Batt, I think to add to the Premier, I'm not sure if the clause in itself, the existence of the clause itself is the issue. When we started earlier, I think the comment was made about the unique type of federation that we have. You have St. Kitts Nevis on one end, and you have Nevis on the other. So there's no syncets that exist. So perhaps it might be time to reconsider that structure as a federation. Perhaps maybe a syncets administration, Nevis administration, and a federal administration, which has been the norm with regards to federations and so on. So I think that maybe we're part of the issue. All right.
It was, in fact, the Premier has just mentioned it to me. I was just about to say it was part of the original proposal. The difficulty that I see that we have in terms of going back to that is that it has worked to some degree as it exists now. And there is a cost factor now that you would have to address. Is it worth the additional cost to do that, bearing in mind that things have worked? I think you and I will disagree on the question of 113, but I do believe that because there's a good case made that Nevis is entitled to and should be able to manage its affairs, and the specified matters could be increased. The list of specified matters could be increased. But you cannot expect a federal, and I'm not speaking for the government, let me just make that absolutely clear, but you cannot expect a federal government to be comfortable providing subventions, assisting in guarantees, being comfortable to do that when at any time, depending on the climate in the country, you can get up and say goodbye. And those responsibilities and liabilities are left to the no-Saintless government.
Gentlemen, we'll take a quick break here. We're at the other half hour mark, so we have about less than 30 minutes to go. So we'll continue our fascinating conversation. I encourage you to stay with us. We'll be right back.
Nevis at the nicest place, but I run from him and defend it like a Lensha say. Now sell out me country, my little paradise. I am a product of the island. I know where else I go. Wouldn't change if you know what I know. Land of beauty.
The St. Kitts and Nevis Independence 40 Committee presents Conversations, Reflections, and the Way Forward. This interactive discussion series provides an in-depth view of the trials and achievements of the past, as well as the accomplishments, threats, and tremendous opportunities of today, and in the coming years that will transform the Twin Island Federation into a model sustainable island state, serving as a beacon for all. On this edition, we consider constitutional reform. The St. Kitts and Nevis Independence 40 Committee presents Conversations, Reflections, and the Way Forward. This interactive discussion series provides an in-depth view of the trials and achievements of the past, as well as the accomplishments, threats, and tremendous opportunities of today, and in the coming years that will transform the Twin Island Federation into a model sustainable island state, serving as a beacon for all. On this edition, we consider constitutional reform. The St. Kitts and Nevis Independence 40 Committee presents Conversations, Reflections, and the Way Forward. This interactive discussion series provides an in-depth view of the trials and achievements of the past, as well as the accomplishments, threats, and tremendous opportunities of today, and in the coming years that will transform the Twin Island Federation into a model sustainable island state, serving as a beacon for all. On this edition, we consider constitutional reform.
Welcome back to Conversation, Reflections, and the Way Forward. We continue our discussion on constitutional reform, and allow me to, in case you're just joining us, to reintroduce our guests. We have former Attorney General of St. Kitts and Nevis, Lena Bart, the Premier of Nevis and Member of the Federal Parliament, Mark Grantley, the Honorable Mark Grantley, Mauriel Knight, who is the President of the St. Kitts National Youth Parliament Association, and Attorney Eustace Nisbet. So, gentlemen, we had a robust discussion just now in terms of the Constitution and how we can change and 113, which is in the Constitution. And so we want to look specifically about some specific aspects of the Constitution now, and in terms of how we can be upgraded. And I think last week would be a good jump-off point to start, where we had the discussion of equal access. The topic for conversations was universal education and the CFBC. And the debate really raged a lot around equal access. How do you think the Constitution can be amended to reflect, as we said, the changing realities in terms of persons? The Federation is becoming a bit more of a melting pot in terms of persons from different nationalities. Of course, there are persons who may be differently abled. Premier, you mentioned your interest in the LGBTIQ area and stuff. How do you think the Constitution can be amended to address the aspect of equal access?
Question for me?
Question for anyone, sir.
I thought you were going to first.
Equal access can mean a lot of different things, obviously. I think you mentioned access to education as an example. I think we must approach these matters in a very thoughtful and careful way, because rights that are guaranteed under the Constitution can then mean that the state assumes a financial responsibility to ensure that people have those rights. Let us say you were, for example, to guarantee a right to education, whatever form that will take. It will mean that the state then becomes financially responsible for ensuring that people have access to education and can find itself liable if, for example, a school has to be closed for some reason and people are out of school or whatever the case may be. I believe it was a previous administration that had put provisions in place, for example, that we had to go to school until we were, 16, I think it is. So there was a sense of mandatory secondary education for everyone. But that comes with a cost, and that is why some other countries didn't do it. Now, that wasn't a constitutional provision. I'm simply saying that that was a legislative prescription that we've had. So we first have to approach this from the position that once we guarantee rights, those rights also come with some responsibility on the part of the state and could mean financial responsibility. And for small states like us, that is always a concern, whether we have the financial wherewithal to do some of the things that we've committed to do. In terms of equality more broadly, I believe that it is time for us to look at our human rights provisions. We have to look at what's happening elsewhere in the world, in North America, in Canada, in the European sphere, even in Central and Latin and Central America. We need to see what is happening globally, the other countries in the Commonwealth, and how they have expanded their notion of what human rights are. And I believe that that expansion has to be part of the conversation. As I said, we may ultimately determine that we are satisfied as a society with where we are. And it's an uncomfortable conversation to have, particularly in the context of LGBTQ and that, because we know that we have a very strong religious and sometimes almost a fundamentalist approach to religion. We know that some pastors have a very strong view. But that ought not to prevent us from having the conversation.
But does that change the unique identity of St. Kitts and Nevis?
But this is my point that I've been trying to make. I think our identity is an evolving concept. The idea that Mr. Knight, who wasn't thought of in 1983, is going to have the same identity as Mr. Bart, who was at Marlborough House, or Mr. Nisbet, who's younger than I am, or myself, I think is far-fetched. You yourself commented that we're now a melting pot. We have signed on to certain protocols. The OECS, for example, the OECS nationals can now come in. They get 6 months automatically, they can work, no problem. CARICOM nationals with a skills certificate, the same. We are seeing now an influx of people from not just the Caribbean, from all over the world. So I was at a restaurant today, it was an Indian restaurant here in Nevis, very popular. They asked a question, 40 years ago, did we have Indian food being served at an Indian restaurant and local people going and buying it? Our society is evolving. We have the same debate when it comes to culture and all that. People are debating, well, what is our culture? But the culture is evolving. As people intermarry, as our society evolves, our society changes. So the notion of what is our identity, yes, I think we have something that is uniquely Kitish and Nevisian, but we have to reflect that that something is subject to change over time. What our parents did and our grandparents did, we don't do. I don't know how to ride a donkey, but those before me would know how, because that was their mode of transportation.
You're losing your culture.
Huh? No, but I don't think we're losing it. I think it's evolving. And I think that our Constitution and our supreme law, because that's what the Constitution is, has to look at the realities of our society and not just say, we had this 40 years ago, so we're going to stick with it. But if you look at it in 2023, we must also say, where are we going to be in 40 years from now? And so in a way, the Constitution must be forward-looking as well. It must predict to some extent what is likely to happen and try to respond to it.
But a part of that premiere, of course, is that people must first be able to have access to the Constitution and be able to understand and read in the Constitution. And so it's a question that I would like to direct to Mr. Knight and also to Mr. Nisbet, in the sense of, do you think that the language of the Constitution needs to be updated when there is some constitutional reform, or maybe a separate document produced that is more reader-friendly in terms of the younger generation?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say it comes down to the language alone. I think it also comes to the fact of interest in our civic processes, because I think at Skinniper that's something we've been trying to push, breaking down the legislative process, breaking down the constitutional clauses and provisions. And even at times you see that that's not really the appetite of the people within our nation. And so I think the question then becomes, how do you change the mindset of people so that they want to feel more involved in their processes? And a lot of people, my vice president always says that election day is not just every 5 days, every 5 years, it's every day. Every day we interact with our government branches, every day we go out and we work, whether it is for the civil service or the private sector contributing to the government. And so I think the question then becomes, how do we educate our people on the Constitution? How do we teach the young children the Constitution and its importance so that they can come to value it and they could come to understand it and see what is within it, so that they too can have that deep understanding and that deep appreciation that these are rights and provisions that some people in other countries in the world really want to desire. And to have those would just be a dream. But here we are taking some of these provisions for granted, not understanding it. There are some people who have never read the Constitution and never desire to. And so I think the question is, on a much bigger scale, how do we change the mindset of people to become more civic-minded? And I think the answer would only come down to education.
Mr. Nisbet?
Well, not to totally disagree with my friend here, but I would take a different slant. And I would ask the question, I think there are two other lawyers on the panel. If in interpreting the Constitution, that there are issues that the judges or the lawyers may have and differences of opinion, and if the answer to that is yes, then surely the language of the Constitution must be an issue. When I went to law school, for example, one of the things that they started doing in England was to change the language with regards to law and how you draft, and even with regards to drafting of documents for the court, because the issue should really be that the ordinary man should have access to that information and understand that information with regards to the easiest and the ordinary language, the ordinary man, ordinary language. So it's a combination of both, that you must have education, but you also must have a language that is acceptable and that would attract the citizens to read.
If you make the language too ordinary, they don't have need for lawyers anymore. But on a serious note, I think that we also have to accept that our societies have changed. And while I listen and I agree with the sentiments expressed, we sometimes, no matter how ordinary the language, the question is whether or not our people, particularly our young people, are interested. I have been around government for a little while, I've been around politics for a little while, and I continue to be amazed at how many people I interact with whose responses I don't know or I didn't hear. And I said, but if you don't know, you didn't hear, in a climate where there's so much access to information now. There is every conceivable means of communication that now exists.
Everyone has a cell phone.
Everyone has a cell phone, everyone has access to social media platforms. Newspapers and even radio might be becoming obsolete because people are getting information. But you have a constant notion amongst our people, and regrettably, I don't mean to pick on Mr. Knight, but our younger people, I see it more, where it's like it's a burden on them if they have to read something. So you're telling them to read the Constitution? You know? I get that very real sense that, yes, I agree we have to go back to civics and all that, but we have a growing trend that I've observed where our people tune out of certain things. And you look at our young children, for example, if it's a hip song, if it's a new song, if it's a new slang, they know it right away. But you say to them, okay, we're going to break this down, even if
That's the issue.
And I was about to say that.
No, but
the medium has to be looked at as well.
But some things don't necessarily lend themselves, in my view, to a slang or a slogan. Some things do require some element of study and analysis.
That is true, but the medium that you create to have that study and analysis done should be tailored to your audience. I mean, naturally, you can't expect a 10-year-old to be driven to go and pick up the Constitution and read it, but perhaps if they saw it in an infographic or a video or even a song, I think they would be minded to at least, you just need to catch their attention, and once they're interested to some extent, then the drive would be created to go and seek out and to find more.
I will yield. I think that is good advice.
And I'd like Mr. Bart to weigh in on the matter as well.
Well, I think there are two matters there. First is the question of access, and the second is the issue of, remind me again, because we got so...
language.
The language. And in terms of the rights, the civil rights, the issue of rights. The first one, in terms of the language, I agree that one should try and simplify it as much as possible for the ordinary individual. But in so doing, you've got to remember that there are a number of cases which have already provided settled decisions on certain aspects of the language. And so you wouldn't want to lose those, because at least you've got some kind of certainty in respect of that language. So yes, simplify as much as you can, but don't go overboard, because realistically. On the question of rights, additional rights, I agree that it's very simple to craft the language. The language is the easy part. But what governments should be doing, in fact, we attempted to do it during the time I was there, but of course you fall behind on it, is that before you pass any piece of legislation, there should be a cost-benefit analysis plus a cost, a budget cost for passing that. In terms of the rights you're talking about, the right to education, the right to health care, the right to work, those are things which, as the Premier said, do have serious costs. Mm-hmm. And so a state like ours would have difficulties implementing them as a right in the context of a constitution. But that doesn't mean that we can't make an effort in the meantime, which we have done, for instance, in terms of education, because now everyone in St. Kitts and Nevis has a right to an education, mm-hmm. although it's not a constitutional right. Yes. And the right not only is within the confines of St. Kitts, in fact, it includes scholarships and providing the financing to make it possible to go abroad. So it may be that a state like ours might have to adopt that in terms of the issue of rights, those type of rights. The difference is that if you didn't get a scholarship to go and study, if you had a constitutional right, you could take the government to court over it. But if you didn't get it, you probably will find some other mechanism, even within the context of the state, to get it. And so we'll probably have to continue that. There are other areas, for instance, but in the areas of health, environmental issues, and so on. Again, we can tackle those not as constitutional rights, but rights in terms of the laws of the country, which enables us to address them, rather than put the burden on the state in finances, because the difficulties about that includes this fact that if you have rights, but there's no finance to assist, it makes a nonsense of the whole thing. And so you've got to find a mechanism to be able to deliver, but not to the detriment of the country as a whole.
Gentlemen, unfortunately, we are out of time. This discussion is one certainly that we could continue for the next hour and a half as well too, but unfortunately we'll probably have to reserve it for some other time. So for now I'd like to thank Mr. Eustace Nisbet, attorney, President of Scanaipa, Mauriel Knight, Premier of Nevis, Member of the Federal Parliament, Mark Brantley, the Honorable Mark Brantley, and Liliana Bart, who is a former Attorney General for St. Kitts and Nevis. And we would like to thank you for being with us for this edition of discussion, for conversations. We trust that you would have enjoyed the discussion, and we hope that you will be with us next week. Premier, I think you'd like to hear the topic next week. Should St. Kitts and Nevis become a republic? We'll join you.
The answer is no.
We'll see you then. For now, I'm Ian Richards. Thanks for joining us for conversations, reflections, and the way forward.
The St. Kitts and Nevis Independence 40 Committee presents Conversations, Reflections, and the Way Forward. This interactive discussion series provides an in-depth view of the trials and achievements of the past, as well as the accomplishments, threats, and tremendous opportunities of today, and in the coming years that will transform the Twin Island Federation into a model sustainable island state, serving as a beacon for all. On this edition, we consider constitutional reform.